Thank you. Thanks, Anne-Christine. And Anne-Christine, don't sit down because you are now going to join us along with all of our other first panel members. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the format that you're used to now. We've had some keynote speakers, and we're now going to invite them, plus a couple of valued extra panel members to come onto the stage. So I'm going to tell you who we've got up here and then give them all a very warm round of applause to welcome them. So alongside our keynote speakers, we've got Paul Holthus with us, who is the founding president and CEO of the World Ocean Council. Welcome to you, Paul.
Thank you.
Of course, we've got Vidar Helgesen, we've got Anne-Christine. We've also got Pete Windsor, who is the Arctic Program Director of WWF, so welcome to you, Pete, and Kaylee Wiles, who is an environmental psychology lecturer at the University of Surrey in the UK, so welcome, Kaylee, to you too. So please give them all a very warm welcome. So here we are, we're setting out early in the day thoughts about the health of our oceans, but particularly the Arctic Ocean, and we're thinking about this sort of notion of an integrated approach to our oceans, which combines the science, it combines government policy, it combines business, all of the sort of commercial activities that take place in our oceans, and seeks out an integrated approach which can deliver long-term sustainable economic development and ocean health, sustainable ocean health. Can it be done? Well, I think what I want to do at the beginning is just drill down a little bit into the science and to establish what we actually know about what is happening in our oceans. So if I may, I'm going to start with you, Pete. You are the Arctic Program Director. So in terms of the Arctic, just tell me what is now established fact about what is happening to Arctic waters.
Yeah, I've been studying the Arctic Ocean for over 20 years as a physical oceanography professor and now the director for the Arctic program. The Arctic program has been in for almost 30 years studying the Arctic Ocean too and conservation. The Arctic, when I started to study it, is not the Arctic we have now. It's a completely new Arctic. For good and bad, mostly for bad. The Arctic has changed dramatically, and you're going to have a science panel or science panels later on this week that will drill into this. As a scientist, I feel fairly pessimistic about the Arctic at the moment. And I think Vidar talked about, that you have this urgent need for our grandchildren to be, into an ocean that's functional. For me, that's the wrong time scale. So I think within 10 years or 20 years, that's the time scale now that climate change is pushing the Arctic Ocean into a completely new state. So the urgency is paramount for the Arctic, and it's warming, it's losing sea ice, it's a cascade through the ecosystem of the Arctic Ocean that we haven't seen before. So it's unprecedented change, and how we deal with that is a big challenge.
And fundamentally, it's about rising sea temperatures.
It's everything. It's temperature, it's salinity, it's the stratification, it's nutrients, changing pH. The Arctic Ocean is a semi-closed ocean with enormous rivers emptying into it. It's got connections to different oceans through Bering Strait, through the Pacific, and on this side in Tromsø, Atlantic water coming in through Barents Sea and the Fram Strait. So it's an interconnected ocean, and it's feeling the pressure both internally by heating up, but also importing waters and potential other substances from other oceans surrounding us. So it's sort of a double whammy that the Arctic is experiencing.
Well, it's a bleak picture, but it's an important one to hear. Paul, I'm guessing, as CEO of the World Ocean Council, you look at the Arctic, but you look at the wider span of our blue planet. Does it seem to you that the Arctic is sort of suffering quicker, more completely than other oceans on our planet?
Well, certainly in terms of these fundamental climate change effects that we're talking about, as Vidar highlighted, they are being more quickly and significantly felt in the Arctic. So we're seeing ocean change due to global environment and climate change being manifested more sooner and more extensively in the Arctic. But those are the sorts of changes that are affecting the planet, the blue planet, as you say, in a lot of places. And we need to think of the ocean as a global, interconnected, single ecosystem. And so we always use, and many of the speakers have the singular term, the ocean, rather than oceans, to reflect that level of connectivity. So I think the important part of that is that what is being done to understand and tackle these issues that are affecting the ocean and other places can be brought into the Arctic to help us understand and manage the change that is going on there, and vice versa, particularly on these sort of global change impacts that we're seeing more exacerbated in the Arctic, to tackle them in the Arctic because of the urgency there, but also then learn from that to better understand how to manage the ocean elsewhere.
Yeah, well,
part of that is the role of science in understanding that change and helping to deal with these effects elsewhere.
And one interesting element of all of this is the degree to which the science is communicated to the general population, and the degree to which we are more aware now than perhaps even just a year or two ago of the degree to which the oceans must be at the center of a sort of sustainable environmental plan for the planet. Kaylee, I want to turn to you because I'm rather intrigued by your title. You're an environmental psychology specialist at the University of Surrey. So I'm interested to know whether you are looking at the degree to which the science on the oceans has somehow cut through in a new way in recent years to the general public, that we all are more aware and perhaps care more now than we did just a short time ago about the health of our oceans.
And that's a very kind of interesting area, is understanding what people understand about the issues and what we're doing about it. So all of these issues are kind of people-driven. It's our behaviours, it's our decisions which can have an influence. And so over the past few years, we are trying to understand that. Not only what do people understand and think and care about, but what actually drives their behaviour. It's not always the same thing. Someone might care about something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll act accordingly. So there's a lot of multidisciplinary research, not only understanding what are the key behaviours or what are the key issues and impacts, but understanding the roles people have and then the drivers of those behaviours.
But for example, and without wishing to blow the BBC's trumpet too much, I mean, I think it's fair to say for all of you guys who specialise in looking at our oceans and trying to sort of find ways to get our species, humanity, to be more responsible for the health of our oceans, there is no doubt that the BBC series Blue Planet was quite a big deal. It put a new focus on what is actually happening under the surface of the water. So many of the alarm bells that are ringing in terms of coral reef die-off, in terms of sea creatures having to move, if not die off, because of rising temperatures, and in particular the issue of pollution and plastics in the ocean. Does it seem to you that not just one show, but that new emphasis, communicating what is happening in the oceans, is changing people's minds and actually perhaps changing their behaviours in terms of, for example, plastics?
Yes, definitely. And we have been looking at like media reporting and stuff. And so microplastics, the really small bits of plastic. What was that? That term was founded back in 2006, but it's only in the past 5-8 years where it's been progressively coming into our media. And then, like you say, Blue Planet 2 with a whale and stuff. It's so iconic. This is more anecdotal because the psychological and social science research is still trying to actually examine this. But there's so much reference to it, and just talking to people, they will refer to that. And so when they talk about like plastic bag fees and fines and stuff, it's often linked to, we're saving the turtles or we're saving the...
Would you all, in your different ways, recognise that something has changed in terms of the willingness of the public to engage with this debate and actually demand political action from their governments, their leaders?
Yes, certainly, and particularly on plastics. I think because plastic is something concrete, we all deal with it, we all relate to it in our daily lives. On climate change, we're seeing the same thing, but not as massively and not as broadly based in the population, because climate change can't be seen as a phenomenon. You can see the results of it, but it's more distant.
In a funny sort of way, I thought in your speech you sort of suggested that we shouldn't get too hung up on pollution and plastics, because in the biggest picture, that is not the thing we should be most worried about in terms of the health of our oceans.
I said that to provoke that kind of... I mean, plastics is probably the fastest growing pollution problem for the ocean, but climate change is affecting the ocean in deeper and more profound ways. and ways that we don't really know all about. As I mentioned, we thought that because of the warming waters in the Arctic, there's more cod coming. There's Atlantic cod now in the Arctic waters, which is, in isolation, good for fisheries.
But very
But
transient.
because
in
of
your view.
acidification, that is a passing blessing.
Right.
And this is huge. And when I mention that long historical perspective, it's because since the 11th century, the codfish has been the mainstay of Norway's economy. And the fact that it could be lost in a century with a business as usual scenario, that's dramatic.
Yeah, I think this Arctic messaging is interesting because I think there's a disparity between people that live in the Arctic and people that live, say, in the US. I lived in Fairbanks, Alaska for 10 years in a place that's the coldest city in the North America. And if you live in that landscape and if you work with the people around the Arctic, that's a whole different ballgame on how you view Arctic issues. And especially in the US, there's a big disparity between understanding that the Arctic can also influence climate globally. So there's always this, oh, the Arctic is suffering from climate change, and that's something that happens somewhere else and affecting
Somehow
the
it's
Arctic.
ring-fenced, it's far away, and,
Yeah, and-
we're not going to worry about it too much because it doesn't impinge on our daily
Yeah, and I
life.
think that's a problem because the Arctic has a really strong effect on global climate and potentially some very critical tipping points with melting Greenland ice sheet and the pooling up of freshwater in the Arctic. The release of that can, for instance, tweak the thermohaline circulation of the whole world. So there's big feedback loops, and melting of permafrost and releasing very potent greenhouse gases are feedback loops that we don't fully understand, and we don't know the impact of those fully. So there's a non-linearity in the climate system that I think we're underappreciating. The climate models are underrepresenting the pace of climate change in the Arctic.
But if we come back always saying, oh, well, you know what, in the end, discussion of the health of our oceans always comes back to the profound dangers of our warming climate, then in a sense it's very difficult then to find solutions that are about the oceans, because you always go back to the political capitals, to the politicians, to the ability or otherwise to implement the Paris Accord and other agreements that may or may not give us any kind of chance of limiting temperature rise below the 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is now deemed to be such a vital threshold. You know, here we sit in Tromsø at an Arctic Frontiers Conference. If it really all goes back to that, what the heck can anybody here do?
Well, I think, Stephen, one of the really important parts of this is that there are all of these different uses of the ocean in the Arctic and elsewhere. And so there's, to tackle a lot of the other pieces that aren't about the global change level and the policy and climate change scale of what's going on in the Arctic and the other oceans. Let's think about this. You know, we're terrestrial beings, but in the ocean, which is this huge part of our economy, as Vidar has pointed out, the vast majority of humanity that's using the ocean is the private sector. So we've got 80 to 90,000 commercial vessels, 3 to 4 million fishing boats, tens of thousands of oil rigs, an increasing number of aquaculture platforms, 1 million kilometers of submarine cable, etc. These are the activities that are both using and need to be responsible for the impacts of their use. So there's a whole series of human use impacts associated with those. And I would say part of the reason for optimism about the ocean is that we have an increasing number of good, smart people and good, smart companies that operate in the ocean that care about the future of that ocean. There's some great companies here in Norway and around the world, and this is the work we do is to harness those leadership companies to work together on ensuring that we've got leadership and action on addressing those impacts and being a part of solutions to the ocean. And just to give one specific example that's particularly relevant to here in the Arctic, harnessing the role of those commercial vessels, the increasing number of commercial vessels that are operating in the Arctic to collect data. So we have, for example, a major program to engage those vessels in either hosting or deploying scientific instruments that bring in data in the parts of the Arctic, and this is happening elsewhere in the world, to help us better understand the ocean, to monitor change, to feed that data to the scientists, to the government institutions that then do the modeling and predicting of change and keeping track of how the health of the ocean is being impacted.
Your vision is of increasingly responsible commercial exploitation of the oceans at the very same time as we are all agreeing the oceans are in profound crisis.
Well, as we're seeing with the climate, the leadership is coming from the business community in so many parts of these issues that we need to really optimize that.
To some, skeptical, if not cynical, that might just sound like it's too good to be true, that business somehow has seen the light and is now committed to this fully sustainable, responsible management of commercial operations in the oceans. I wonder if everybody is buying it.
No. The Arctic Ocean is already a stressed ecosystem, and it's being stressed even more now with climate change. So I think if we're going to develop a sustainable blue economy that this conference is talking about, the Smart Arctic, we need to first think about the ecosystem, and we need to develop large marine protected areas and a network of them. This is being worked in PAIM, and then we have in WWF a PAMPAM project.
So I'm going to go to questions. Anne-Christine, this is the nub of what I think is going to be the debate throughout the day, the balance between what is being called responsible exploitation and outright protection. Where do you sit on this balance?
Well, in a way, I think that as a scientific community, we are not going to give the solution or take the decision on that, but we're going to give the basis for the policymakers and the decision makers to take that decision. And that is where I think that it's important to use the scientific community to actually give the background for these considerations that are going to make some trade-offs in the end when you're making the decisions. And that's where I see that there is a need for a dialogue between the scientific community and the decision makers, that which scenarios is it that we're going to provide the science for. We can give the considerations then as a scientific community, but we can't tell whether you're going to make
wonderfully delicate and diplomatic answer.
Or whether you're going to make exploitation. I don't think it's a diplomatic answer, but I think this is the way how you should actually do your decision making.
Yeah, okay. Well, no, I take the point. Go on then, give us a final thought, and then I'm going to go to the audience. So,
okay, I'll be very crisp. Marine protected areas is good and important, but it is more important to manage 100% of the ocean well than to fully protect 10% of it.
Right.
Currently, in the Aichi target from the marine biodiversity, the target is 10% by next year, and Norway is less than 1%.
But
so
if
there's a disparity between these two comments.
If you look at the definition in some countries of their marine protected areas, I'm quite confident that our ocean territories are managed better than those so-called MPAs.
Well, it is a very interesting debate, and clearly there's a difference on our panel. I would like people to contribute to it, so let's get hands up and let's get contributions. So we'll start here with you, ma'am, and then we'll go to you. So just hang on and we'll get you a microphone. Yep, just this lady here.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the panel members. My name's Mary Ellen Miller. I'm the Australian ambassador to Norway, also Denmark and Iceland. You might wonder, what is an Australian ambassador doing at Arctic Frontiers? But I remind people that Australia and Norway share a border in Antarctica. So I was very pleased, Vidar, to hear you mention that your new ice-breaking vessel is taking its first voyage to the Antarctic. Australia is a proud member of the high-level panels established by your Prime Minister. So I wondered if you could reflect a little bit on the learnings, the potential collaboration, the sharing that can happen from looking at a place like the Antarctic is clearly very different from the Arctic. People don't live and work in the Antarctic in the same way, but there must be learnings and opportunities to share knowledge and research that will benefit both poles.
Do you want to quickly respond?
Yeah, no, I think you're pointing to something very important, and Norway's commitment to a knowledge-based and science-based approach to the ocean applies to both the polar regions and elsewhere. And in the Antarctica, as there are discussions about establishing new major marine protected areas there, our line is that we would like to see that happen, but we need the protection regimes to match what is the science relating to the resources there. And a final point on that, given the changes that are taking place, science is not something that you have once for all. You need a much more dynamic approach in science and in protection regimes and in politics in general.
All right, I think there was a question. Yeah, let's get you the microphone.
Thank you. I would like to know a little bit more about the non-linearity of the response of the ecosystems, and especially like some years ago, people were talking about changes in the currents and stuff like that, if this is still considered or not. And
Okay, who wants to take that?
I can take
Yeah.
it as the token oceanographer.
Yeah.
There are big nonlinearities, and one example I can give you is in my backyard in Alaska in the Bering Sea. In the middle of last winter, we had 20% of the Bering Sea that was completely ice-free. And that comes with an enormous amount of heat getting into the ocean, all sorts of implications for the ecosystem, from the marine mammals that depend on the ice to the people who depend on that area for fishing, for instance. Non-linearities are something we struggle with in science. We like, as humans, to think of things to be linear in processes because it makes sense in our brains, and non-linearities are hard to deal with. I think consistently we've been underestimating the pace and the rate of change in the Arctic, and there's a lot of negative feedback loops, some of which we understand pretty well, like the albedo feedback on the disappearing sea ice, but there are other very strong feedback loops that will come into play within the next 10 years.
So you mean that the pace of change that we see already, which is alarming, could get much, much worse, and we can't.
Absolutely.
There's no way we can predict because of the non-linearity of this.
The science is doing a great job, and modeling is coming a long way. We have satellite observations. I think there's new technology we can talk about later on today that I think will enable us to study the Arctic even in the seasons that we struggle, which is the winter. We have very summer-dependent data, and we don't have data across the seasons, but non-linearity will for sure surprise us and have us sort of with our pants down for future climate.
Well, there's another happy thought. Yeah, we're doing
I'm all doom and gloom. I'm from Sweden, so
No.
you know,
I mean,
it's the Ingmar Bergman effect.
It's actually interesting for Kaylee, going back to the environmental sort of psychology part of this. I obviously, in my day job and all sorts of other activities, I talk a lot about the way in which messages are communicated and what works. And there is a feeling these days that one should avoid too much bleakness and negativity when one is trying to encourage populations to take responsibility and come up with proactive solutions to what we see before us in terms of climate change. So when Pete very honestly and scientifically explains all of his concerns and worries, do you think, oh my God, just yet more negativity, this isn't helping? Or
I think we need to be realistic and know what the concerns and stuff are. But in terms of engaging the public, we do need to be careful with the messaging. So if you say it's all doom and gloom and give the impression that it's basically too late, then most people will just like turn off and say, well, there's no point now acting. So whilst emotional messages can actually catch attention and get people to pay attention, it's not always the most proactive and effective method. It's actually, rather than making them aware of the issue, it's about what they can actually do about it. So whilst you are, I guess, quite pessimistic on the potential of where this will take us in years to come, long-term and short-term, I am quite optimistic that there are actually avenues and people are listening, but we just need to make sure that we don't over-exaggerate the science, because there's still lots of questions we haven't answered yet. And so we need to be truthful with the public and with all stakeholders so they are on the same wavelength, and try not to, I guess, overplay the heartstrings, because they might just turn off. So
right, well, that is a real challenge, isn't it? Being both truthful, but also finding a way of engaging and getting people to commit to behavioral change rather than throw up their hands and say, oh.
And there are solutions. I mean, we have a long row of possible solutions for a sustainable Arctic, and I think they're out there.
Well, in our different ways through the course of the day, in terms of all the different Arctic activities, we're going to be talking about whether there really are solutions, sustainable sort of ways of approaching ocean commercial exploitation. So that's something we'll definitely get into.